USA Freedom Act, H.R. 2048. We asked unanimous consent to bring that to the floor and to have open debate and discussion, an open amendment process, with the understanding that we'd turn back to the Trade Promotion Authority bill as soon as we had properly disposed of this legislation, as soon as we had finished debating it, discussing it, voting on amendments. Now, I'm a big believer in free trade. I like free trade. I think free trade is good. I'd like to see us get to both of these pieces of legislation. But importantly, H.R. 2048 is a piece of legislation that has kind of a fuse attached to it. You know, Section 215 of the PATRIOT Act is set to expire at the end of this month. And many of us believe that we ought to at least have a debate and discussion before that happens, a debate and discussion about what, if anything, would take its place, about whether or not we need something to put in its place, and if so, what that might look like. And so that's why we made this request. This request, which we regarded as a very reasonable one, was unfortunately one that drew an objection, and so we were not able to bring it to the floor. Now, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, based in New York, recently addressed this issue, recently addressed the issue of whether or not Section 215 of the PATRIOT Act can appropriately be read to authorize the NSA to engage in this bulk metadata collection program. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit answered that question in the negative and concluded that there is no statutory authority for the NSA to collect this type of metadata. It doesn't have the authority. It cannot collect bulk metadata on this basis because, as the Second Circuit concluded, the business records sought under that provision have to be relevant. There has to be some relevance to something they're investigating. And of course, their only relevance here under this program is that they exist, is that they represent phone calls made by someone in the United States, that they were made under a telephone network in the United States. That can't be the answer. That cannot reflect a proper understanding of this concept of relevance that's in Section 215 of the PATRIOT Act. It can't, and it doesn't. And this court ruling is one of the many reasons why we need to be having this debate and why we shouldn't be willing to simply reauthorize Section 215 of the PATRIOT Act with the understanding that the NSA will continue operating this program as is if we reauthorize it. It's one of the reasons why I've been so insistent on having this discussion and so unwilling to support even a shorter-term reauthorization of the PATRIOT Act, is because they're interpreting Section 215 of the PATRIOT Act beyond its logical breaking point. You know, we have to remember that the Constitution is worth protecting. It's worth protecting even when we can't point to anything bad that's happening right now, even when we can't point to any specific abuse that is occurring. Bulk data collection is itself a type of abuse. There is a type of constitutional injury, even though we can't point to anything secondary from that. We can't point to any horrible secondary effect from it. It is in and of itself wrong. The wrongness of this program can be illustrated when we take to its logical conclusion the very arguments presented by the NSA for this type of activity. Let me explain. So, the metadata that's collected by the NSA right now relates exclusively to telephone calls. The records they collect involve records of who you call, when you call them, who calls you, when they called you, and how long the phone calls at issue lasted. That's it. But if the NSA is correct in its interpretation of Section 215, which it is not, but if it were correct, there is absolutely no reason why the NSA could not also collect a number of other types of metadata. Metadata records, for example, involving your use of your credit card, involving hotel reservations, involving airplane reservations, metadata regarding emails that you've either sent or received, who you've sent them to and who you've received them from, your internet traffic, where you've purchased online, who's purchased something from you online, all kinds of things. From that metadata, they clearly could paint a much more vivid picture of you, a profile built as a mosaic from 1 billion data points. They can tell everything about you from that type of metadata. Now, sure, the NSA is not collecting that type of metadata right now. They're not doing it right now. But if we reauthorize this without limitation, if we reauthorize Section 215 of the Patriot Act and we don't include any kind of restriction on it, there is absolutely no reason why the NSA couldn't conclude tomorrow or next week or a year from now or later that it wants to collect this kind of data as well. Most Americans, I would suspect nearly all Americans, would be shocked and horrified to think that the NSA could and would and might at some point in the future collect that kind of information on where you shop online, your credit card bills, your hotel reservation, things like that, things that could easily be connected back to an individual, easily give rise to abuse, either for partisan political purposes or for some other nefarious purpose. I also want to point out that those who were in favor of this program and those who vigorously defend its constitutionality routinely rely on a decision rendered by the Supreme Court in the late 1970s called Smith versus Maryland. They point out that in Smith versus Maryland, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of some police activity that involved the collection of calling data. The Supreme Court concluded in that case that there was not a sufficiently significant expectation of privacy in records of calls that somebody had made and received, such that the collection of that data would require a search warrant. I'm not altogether certain that Smith v. Maryland was decided correctly, but let's assume for a minute that it was decided correctly and just address the fact that it is a decision that remains on the books. It's precedent that's followed throughout the courts of the United States. That's fine. Let's just accept the fact that it's on the books. But it is very, very different, not just qualitatively different, not just quantitatively different, rather, but also qualitatively different. When you're dealing not with one target of one single criminal investigation, and not just with maybe a few weeks of calling records, but when you're dealing with 5 years of calling records, not on one person, of one target in one criminal investigation by one group of law enforcement officers, but 300 million people stretched out over 5 years. That calling data becomes more significant, moreover, when Americans become more attached to their telephones, when their telephone isn't something that's just plugged into the wall, but something that's carried with them every moment of every day. This, by the way, adds to the potential list of metadata that could be collected, because, of course, many people now have telephones that track their location. And I don't see any reason why, based on the interpretation of Section 215 of the Patriot Act and the interpretation of the Fourth Amendment that the NSA has put forward, I don't see any reason why they couldn't start collecting the location data as well. which would further undermine privacy interests. So, Smith v. Maryland, whether you like it or not, it's precedent. It's precedent that's followed by the courts in America, but it's not the end of the story. It certainly doesn't get you over the hump when it comes to this type of collection. Saying that what was covered by Smith versus Maryland is the same thing as what the NSA is trying to do here is a little bit like comparing a pony ride to a ride to the moon and back. They both involve some form of transportation, but they're worlds apart, drastically different, so much so that they can't really even be compared. Our technology has changed dramatically over the years, so much so that we don't stop and think about it. We might not even recognize it. A few years ago, when my son James was about 10 years old, he came up with a really good idea that he announced to us. He said, you know, I've been thinking about it, and I'm going to invent something. And we said, what's that? And he said, well, I'm going to invent a telephone that is attached to the wall. It will be attached to the wall so it can't be removed. And it'll have a wire that runs into the wall, and that's how the telephone will work. We looked at him and wondered what gave him this idea and what gave him the idea that that was somehow unique. And we said, well, first of all, what makes you think that hasn't already been invented? And secondly, why would you want to do that? And he said, well, I think it's a great idea because it's the only way you wouldn't lose your phone. Only then did we realize what he was saying. Only then did we realize that what he was telling us was that during his lifetime, he had never seen in our home a phone that was attached to the wall. He had seen cell phones, and he had seen cordless landline phones, and he had seen that telephones get lost from time to time. Our technology does change. And as our technology changes, we have to take that into account. Well, our technology has changed now to the point where our government can learn all kinds of personal facts about us through metadata, through the type of metadata involved here. And it's only getting more and more this way every single day as we transact more and more of our day-to-day business over our telephones, and as our telephones become more sophisticated, more portable, and more capable of processing more and more data. You know, the text of the Fourth Amendment that I quoted just a few minutes ago is still very relevant today. And the fact that the Fourth Amendment refers specifically to the right of the people to be secure in their persons, their houses, their papers, and effects, that language is still relevant today, and it should remind us of the fact that our persons, our houses, our papers, and effects, more and more, really become a part of this, really become a part of our telephones. Our papers are not always physical papers. More and more, they're not. Increasingly, we're even asked to sign documents that previously would have been physically signed on a hard copy with a stack of papers. Increasingly, you can do business transactions without ever handling physical paper. Increasingly, you can do those things electronically. People often prefer to do it that way. It saves time, it saves money, but as more and more of our lives are played out on these portable digital devices, it becomes more and more important for us to remember that there are Fourth Amendment ramifications whenever government wants to get involved in what we do on those same devices. That's why it's not really fair anymore to simply rely reflexively on Smith versus Maryland to say that this is all constitutional. Nor is it fair to say, well, your phone company already has this record, so there's no reason why the government shouldn't have it. I actually don't even see that comparison. Some people think that this is somehow persuasive. I don't find it persuasive at all. There is a world of difference between allowing a private business with which you have voluntarily chosen to interact to have your business records, particularly when it's a private business that you want to have that information so that that private business can keep track of how much you owe them or how much they owe you. There's a world of difference between a private business entity having those records and the government having those records. You know, the worst thing that private business can do is perhaps send you too many emails that you don't want, asking you for more business, or maybe it can give some of your personal data to somebody else who will in turn make phone calls you don't want to receive or send you emails you don't want to receive. That private business has no ability to put you in prison. That private business has no ability to levy taxes on you. That private business has no ability to make your life a living hell in the same way that your government has the ability to do those things. Not just the ability, but lately, with increasing frequency, the strong and seemingly irresistible inclination. This is not a victimless offense against the spirit and arguably the letter of the Constitution. These kinds of things have real-world ramifications. They ought to be troubling to all of us. And we ought to want to do something about them. And so for these reasons, Senator Paul, I'd ask you, don't you think it would be much better to put this bill on the floor now and allow for an open amendment process, one in which you and each of our other colleagues could have an opportunity to provide input and to try to improve the legislation and to try to do something meaningful with this legislation, rather than to just simply ignore it, pretend it didn't exist, sweep it under the rug, and wait until we're up against the cliff, this critical cliff between when the Senate, much to my chagrin and the chagrin of many of our colleagues, is set to adjourn, leading up to the moments when this program is set to expire. Wouldn't we be better off to take this up and to debate this under the light of day, under the view of the American people?
Well, I think the senator from Utah asked a great question, and I think you framed the debate over the Fourth Amendment very well. I think if we asked to put the bill on the floor at this hour, we may not be able to find anybody awake to give us the permission to have the bill this evening, but we haven't been able to locate anyone to get the bill this evening, so I'm afraid we'll have to say no. But we have been asking for a full and open debate. Your solution, as well as mine, as well as Wyden, as well as others, to have a full debate on the floor for this. There were a couple things that you said that I thought were particularly worth commenting on. People say that because, well, there's no evidence that the program is being abused. There's no evidence that we're searching the records of certain people of a certain race or religion or abusing people for some reason, that that's proof somehow that no abuse is occurring. But I agree with you that the collection alone is an abuse in and of itself, because to me, the point is, and the basic point and the biggest part of the point is that what we're dealing with is something that is a generalized warrant. There's nothing specific about collecting all of the records from all Americans all of the time. There's nothing specific about the name Verizon. I tell people I don't know anybody named Mr. Verizon. So that can't be a specific individualized warrant. That's a general warrant, and that's what we fought the revolution over, is to individualized warrants, to individualize what we were requesting, and above all, probable cause. And we accepted a lower standard to go after foreigners, to go after terrorists. And part of me says, well, maybe we can do that just for terrorists, but now we're using it for domestic crime. One of the biggest things that I would like to change is that nothing within the PATRIOT Act or any of this could be used to convict somebody in a domestic court. Section 213, sneak and peek, 99.5% of the time is used for domestic drug crime now. We have the NSA sharing data that's supposed to be collected on foreigners with the domestic DEA, and then making up another scenario in which they might have heard about this but didn't really hear about this from the NSA. I think that the public at large thinks that we've gone way too far with the bulk collection of records. It's not only what we've done, but it's just that there's absolutely, even in the PATRIOT Act, which I object to, absolutely no justification for collecting the records. The idea that records could be relevant to an investigation that has not yet occurred puts logic on its head, puts it topsy-turvy to mean that words don't mean anything. But I'm very concerned that there's a lot of surveillance that we don't know about, not only through the PATRIOT Act justification, but through executive order justification. It concerns me that there are still people who are arguing that Article 2 gives unlimited authority to the president, that there is no congressional check and balance to the president with regard to surveillance. There are people arguing and making that argument that there is no limitation to presidential power. And I think one of the best things our founder fathers gave us was this check and balance, that we had co-equal branches. I think it was a great thing that with the Fourth Amendment that a warrant had to be signed by somebody who wasn't a policeman, who wasn't a soldier. This is one of the additional things that I'd like to do because we don't get to talk about this very much. So we have the ability, and we're talking about bulk collection of records, but we should also talk about whether we should have hundreds of thousands of warrants written by policemen, FBI agents. I think really that warrants should have this check and balance where you have a judge. And there's something that is so civilizing and something that levels the playing field and keeps abuse from happening, that a policeman tonight in D.C. that is in front of a house and wants to go in is calling someone who's not in hot pursuit, who hasn't just had a physical altercation with the people they're chasing, someone who is dispassionate and unconnected to the heat of the crime, is going to give the permission for those policemen to go into a house. We say that a man's house is his castle and he can defend, that was the whole idea, that things within the castle were the man or woman's, we would say now. But you know what? It's not only that your records are in the castle anymore, they're in the cloud. And records are virtual. And records are very rarely, you have whole households that have no paper records. The amazing thing about records is that they're now saying that with metadata records, they can discover more than we could have discovered in a lifetime of looking at your personal letters in your house, because so much information is there. So much can be connected between the dots, between all of these things. I'm still not convinced that we aren't collecting data on credit cards, on email. I think that some of this is done through the executive order that most of us are not privy to. The only people that know anything about the executive order 12333 and what they're doing on it are people on the Intelligence Committee. I'm not convinced that we aren't collecting email data. They currently say that your email, this is the bill that you have promoted, that after 6 months your email has no protection. Before 6 months, I think the only protection is to the content, not to the header, not to the addressee. We currently have the opinion we desperately need the Supreme Court to rule on this. We have the Smith versus Maryland decision, which was in the pre-modern age as far as data goes and as far as your papers being held. We desperately need a decision, and my hope was that the appellate court decision would go to the Supreme Court, but my understanding, being just a doctor, is that it went the other way, that it's been remanded lower and may never make it to the Supreme Court. I don't know that, but I think we do need something at the Supreme Court level. But there have been many who are now arguing that the appellate court, once again, this is from a physician, not a lawyer, is really binding, and there could eventually be some legal injunction against what the government is doing. But for goodness sakes, it perplexes me that the president, who says, oh yes, we need a balanced approach, and I'm listening to my privacy commission, I'm listening to the review board, and yet I created this out of whole cloth as an executive order, and I'm unwilling to stop it even now that the appellate court has told me it's illegal. He's unwilling to stop it. I think that sort of defines disingenuous, that he's going to stop it as soon as Congress stops it. And it is so hard to get anything done here, but we've had vast majorities, not only for the USA Freedom Act, for Thomas Massey's Act, we had a vast majority over there to defund it. For Justin Amash, to defund these things that we were doing, big majorities. But it's another evidence that the Senate is further distant from the people, that the House is closer and they're hearing the message stronger. But I think the message is a strong one. The message is that nobody, I mean, really the vast majority of Americans are very unhappy with having all of their records collected. And that really, to me, it gets back to the whole idea of whether or not we should accept or validate general warrants. And it's still part of my concern a little bit with the reform, that I want the reform, it could go a long way if we no longer had the ability to put the word corporate in there, that if it were specifically individuals. And I think we have a chance to go maybe even a little further than we've gone in the reform that's being offered, to say that we shouldn't be able to request all of the records from a corporation, because that there is some retained privacy interest or some retained property interest even in your records. And I think there always has been. And they talk about an expectation of privacy. I would think that if you have a contract, when you sign the agreement that you are agreeing to a privacy contract with an internet provider or a search provider or a telephone company, I think that's indicating, you know, they talk about in the cases an expectation of privacy. Well, I've signed an agreement with the company and they've promised me and I've promised them. I would think that that for certain is an expectation of privacy in the eyes of the court. So I don't understand how they can argue that we've completely given up our records and that we have no ability at all to retain an interest in our records. But I am very much convinced that this is an important debate, that the Bill of Rights are something that we shouldn't look at lightly, that we should, as we move forward, make sure that we do protect the things that are important, that we shouldn't hurry up and have deadlines and then say we're not going to have time to debate it. And I see the senator from Texas, who is also a defender of the Fourth Amendment, is here, and I'd be happy to take a question without losing the floor.
I thank the senator from Kentucky. I would note that he and I agree on a great many issues, although we don't agree entirely on this issue. But I want to take the opportunity to thank the senator from Kentucky for his passionate defense of liberty. His is a voice that this body needs to listen to. I would note the senator from Kentucky's father spent decades in the House of Representatives as a passionate advocate for liberty. And both his father's voice and the senator from Kentucky's voice has altered the debate in this chamber and has helped refocus the United States Congress and the American people on the critical importance of defending our liberty. I think protecting the Bill of Rights is a fundamental responsibility of the federal government. And it is heartbreaking over the last 6 years that we have seen a federal government that not only fails to protect the Bill of Rights, but that routinely violates the constitutional liberties of American citizens, routinely violates the Bill of Rights. You know, I listened to the learned remarks and questions from the senator from Utah, where he noted that under the justifications for the current bulk collection of metadata, that it is the position of the federal government that they have the full constitutional authority not only to collect metadata, but to collect the positional location of every American if any of us carry our cell phone wherever we go. It is the position of the Obama administration that the federal government has the full constitutional authority to track the location of every American citizen, no matter where we walk. That is a breathtaking assertion of power.
You're doing all right. One time.
And I would note that we don't merely need to speculate that that's the Obama administration's position. Indeed, in a recent case before the United States Supreme Court, the Obama administration argued that law enforcement could place a GPS locator on the automobile of any and every law-abiding citizen in this country and track the location of your automobile and my automobile with no probable cause, no articulable suspicion, no nothing. The Obama administration argued that the Fourth Amendment and the Bill of Rights say nothing about the federal government placing a GPS locator on the automobile of private law-abiding citizens. Now, thankfully, the United States Supreme Court rejected that position. It didn't reject that position 5-4 or 6-3 or 7-2. The United States Supreme Court rejected that radical anti-privacy position of the Obama administration unanimously, 9-0. Now, I am entirely in agreement with my friend, the senator from Utah, that the right resolution of the issue before this body is for the United States Senate to pass the USA Freedom Act. I'm an original sponsor of that bipartisan legislation. The USA Freedom Act does two things. Number one, it ends the federal government's bulk collection of phone metadata for law-abiding citizens. I am entirely in agreement with my friend, the senator from Kentucky, that the federal government should not be collecting the data of millions of law-abiding citizens with no evidentiary basis to do so. It is long past time to end this program, and the USA Freedom Act does so. At the same time, the USA Freedom Act maintains the tools to target terrorists. We're living in a dangerous world with the rise of ISIS and Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram, not to mention Al-Qaeda and radical Islamic terrorism across the globe. The threat to the American homeland has never been greater. And it is critical that law enforcement and national security maintain the tools so that if there is a credible basis to believe that a particular individual is planning a terrorist attack, that we can intercept their communications, we can prevent that terrorist attack before, God forbid, they murder innocent Americans on the homeland. Now, the critical words there are a particular individual, because what the Fourth Amendment envisions is not that law enforcement's hands are tied. Law enforcement has tools to stop crimes. But as my friend, the senator from Kentucky, has so powerfully observed, the Fourth Amendment was designed to prevent general warrants. It was designed to prevent the government from assuming that everyone in the country is automatically guilty and we will seize your information. Rather, the tools of law enforcement and national security should be particularized based on the facts and the evidence. That's why I support the USA Freedom Act, because it accomplishes both goals. It protects our privacy rights and the Bill of Rights of law-abiding citizens, but it ensures we have the tools to prevent acts of terrorism. Now, I would note 2 points that are important. There are a number of members of this body, including a number of members of my party and the party of the senator from Kentucky, who argue the PATRIOT Act should be reauthorized with no changes. And they argue to do anything else would jeopardize our national security. Well, there are two facts that are critical to assess to responding to that argument. Number one, the members of this body have received confidential classified briefings from the national security officers of this administration. We are not at liberty to convey the specific details of those briefings. But the members of this body have been told, number one, that the USA Freedom Act would provide effective tools so that we could prevent acts of terrorism. And indeed, they've gone further to say that it is entirely possible that under the USA Freedom Act, the national security team would have more effective tools to stop actual terrorists than they do today under the bulk metadata collection of law-abiding citizens. That's worth underscoring. The national security professionals advising this body have said the USA Freedom Act could well be more effective in providing the tools to stop terrorists than the current status quo. That argument needs to sit in for everyone arguing we've got to maintain the status quo to stop terrorism. If it is the case, as we have been told, that the USA Freedom Act could be more effective, that argument suddenly falls to the ground. And secondly, I address my friends in the Republican Party who would prefer to reauthorize the PATRIOT Act, even if that is their preference. It is abundantly, abundantly clear that a clean reauthorization of the Patriot Act ain't passing this body, and it certainly ain't passing the House of Representatives. I would note that the USA Freedom Act passed the House of Representatives 338 to 88. It wasn't a narrow victory. It was overwhelming. So even if members of this body would prefer to reauthorize the Patriot Act in its entirety, the votes ain't there. So the choice they face is letting it expire altogether, losing the tools we have to prevent real terrorists from carrying out active terrorism, or accepting a common-sense middle ground that vigorously protects the Bill of Rights while maintaining the tools to target the bad guys. Now, I will say this. With my friend, the senator from Kentucky, I entirely agree that he is fully entitled to introduce his amendments to that bill, that this body should engage in a full and open debate considering amendments, and the senator from Kentucky should be able to propose reasonable common sense improvements to the USA Freedom Act. We ought to debate them on the merits in a full and open process. There was a time not too long ago when this body was called the world's greatest deliberative body. Debate is what we're supposed to do on the merits. And if the defenders of the Patriot Act right now are so confident of their position, they should be prepared to debate the senator from Kentucky on the merits, to debate each of the members of this body on the merits, and to arrive at the right policy that both protects our constitutional rights and ensures we have all the tools we need to protect the safety of American citizens against active terrorism. Now, I will note, standing here with the senator from Kentucky, with the senator from Utah at 11:40 p.m., I'm reminded of the movie The Blues Brothers, saying, "Jake, we got to get the band back together again." I'm reminded of previous evenings, standing here with this same band of brothers in the wee hours of the morn. And I'll make a couple of final observations in this question. The first is, the very first time I ever spoke on the Senate floor, when I was a brand new freshman senator, was during the last time the senator from Kentucky was filibustering. Senator Rand Paul was filibustering against the Obama administration's policy of uncontrolled drone strikes and the refusal of the Obama administration to acknowledge that the Constitution prohibits the federal government from using a drone to target a United States citizen with lethal force if that citizen does not pose an imminent threat on U.S. soil. When the senator from Kentucky began that filibuster that morning, he had asked if I might come out and support him, and I told him at the time, as a newbie in this body, that I wanted to respect the institutions of the Senate, which include the tradition that freshman senators should stay quiet for a number of months before speaking. So initially I said, no, I'm not going to come down. It's not yet time for me to speak on the Senate floor, and yet he stood there, and 1 hour and 2 hours passed. I could not stand back without joining him in that support, in that epic fight. That time, I'm reminded it was an anniversary of the Battle of the Alamo, so I had the opportunity to read to my friend William Barrett Travis's letter from the Alamo, and to give him the encouragement of Texans who gave their lives in defense of liberty. And indeed, at the time, to read tweets that were sent in support of the senator from Kentucky. And I've said many times, I will go to my grave in debt to Senator Rand Paul that the first opportunity I had to speak on the Senate floor was in support of his epic filibuster. I would also note that following that filibuster, Senator Paul gave me two pieces of advice. both of which proved very helpful for a filibuster I was to do of my own several months later. Advice number one, he said, was wear comfortable shoes. And I would note Senator Paul observed that the last time he did that, he didn't follow this advice. He hadn't planned to speak as long as he had. He told me his feet hurt for 2 weeks. And I will confess it was to my great shame. I'm wearing today my argument boots, which I wear every day on the Senate floor. But when I filibustered on Obamacare, I shamefully left my boots in the closet and went and purchased black tennis shoes. And as the hours wore on, I was very, very grateful that I had abided by Senator Paul's good advice and wore the tennis shoes. And I would note, as I'm sitting here today, that the good senator is wearing tennis shoes today, so I'm glad to see that he follows his own advice, and I have no doubt that his calves and thighs will thank him tonight in the morning. The second bit of advice Senator Paul gave me was drink very, very little water. Now, that was advice he acknowledged likewise he had not followed in his own filibuster. And I will note, not too long ago, I was sitting in the president's chair presiding, and the entire hour I was there was a glass of water on Senator Paul's desk, and he did not drink a sip of it. I would note that was advice I endeavored to follow. It was good advice, and I'm glad to see my friend is following it as well. This is an exceptionally important issue that this body should be focused on, the responsibility to protect the Bill of Rights and the constitutional rights of every American. And so the question I would ask my friend, the senator from Kentucky, is there any excuse for this body not taking seriously our obligation to protect the Bill of Rights and the constitutional rights of privacy of every American?
I want to thank the senator from Texas for joining in the battle to defend the Bill of Rights and the Fourth Amendment, and I know he's sincere in that approach. There's absolutely no excuse not to debate this and no excuse not to vote on sufficient amount of amendments to try to make this better, to try to make the bulk collection of records go away. It's what the American people want. It's what the Constitution demands. My voice is rapidly leaving. My bedtime is long since passed. And I think it's time that we summarize why we're here today and what my hope is for the future with this issue. We've had a dozen senators come down from both parties, from right and left, conservative, liberal, progressive, libertarian. We've had several friends come over from the House as well. There's a hunger in America for somebody to stand up, for all of us to stand up, for somebody to do the right thing, to say that the Bill of Rights needs to be defended, that the Bill of Rights is important. When I think of the Bill of Rights, I think, it isn't so much for the popular person. It isn't so much for the high school quarterback or the prom queen. The Bill of Rights is for the least among us. And the Bill of Rights is to try to prevent any kind of systemic bias from entering into the law or the way we treat people. People will say, well, we collect all this data, but we're not abusing anyone. We're doing it perfectly in order. But I agree with Senator Lee that just the collection of the data is the infringement in itself. The whole idea that we could put one name on a warrant and collect 100 million records goes against everything we believe in. It goes against everything we fought for in the Revolution when we fought to be left alone. I think Justice Brandeis put it best when he said that the right to be left alone is the most cherished of rights, the most prized among civilized men. To be left alone. To be left alone in our castle, or in today's world, to be left alone in our cloud. The time is long since past where we're going to have paper records and that it's going to be our exact home, our exact castle that we're protecting. The time is now in the digital age that we need to protect our privacy when we loan out our records. And it is different to loan out your records and let them to be held by a telephone company or by an internet provider or in the cloud. It doesn't mean that you give up your right to privacy. I think that you have an expectation of privacy with or without a contract, but often we have an explicit privacy agreement, an explicit privacy contract that we actually have with the phone company, that we actually have with the internet provider. They're supposed to protect our interests. It sends exactly the wrong signal to give liability to these companies, liability protection to these companies, and say to them that they can run roughshod with us and that they can give their information out. The bulk collection must end, and I think we have the votes to do it now. We need to end the bulk collection of records, but that's not where this battle ends. There still is a question of whether or not the executive is gathering a great deal of information through executive order. I think that has to be reviewed. It has to be reviewed in public. I agree with my friend Senator Wyden that the specifics of intelligence, who the agents are, how we break code, how we technologically gather information, by all means doesn't need to be discussed in public. But whether or not we should collect all Americans' phone records all the time should be discussed in public. It should have been revealed in an honest way. The fact that the director of our national intelligence lied to us and said the program didn't even exist, I think is unforgivable and makes him unsuitable to lead our intelligence agency. We have to have trust. Because of this great and enormous power we allow our intelligence agencies to have, we have to have trust. And you can't have trust when Congress is lied to. I think as we move forward, today we've made great strides in presenting arguments in the debate for how we would make things better, how we would better circumscribe this great and ominous power, and how we would better make this power conducive to the Constitution. The ultimate success will be that we can actually change things, but part of the success will be that we've debated them today. And my hope is that the debate today will let the American public, as well as our leadership in the Senate, know that we're serious about this, and that we want to vote on reforms, that we want to vote on several different forms of ways that we can fix this, and that this goes on and comes up every 3 years. For goodness sakes, can't we spend a couple of days trying to amend this, trying to make it better? I want to thank the Senate staff for coming in and staying. I don't think you had much choice, but thank you for staying and not throwing things. We'll try not to do this, but every couple of years or so. I want to thank my staff for their help in a long day. And I want to thank the American people for considering the arguments and hopefully for helping us push this towards a reform where we all respect the Fourth Amendment and the Bill of Rights once again. Thank you, Mr. President, and I relinquish the floor.